Today, we're going to talk about one of the darkest moments in all of human history, the Black Death. But we're going to look past the horror, just for a moment, to see how this incredible catastrophe wasn't just an ending for millions of people, but also a brutal, completely unintentional beginning for the world that came next.
It's a heavy question, right? But it's really the heart of what we're exploring today. You know, we usually think of history being shaped by famous kings or brilliant inventions. But what happens when the most powerful force for change is something you can't even see?
All right, so to really get the scale of this, we need to picture the world the plague was about to crash into. Think of Europe in the 1340s. It was a continent that was, frankly, stretched to its absolute breaking point.
Society was basically this fixed pyramid. You had kings and lords at the very top, who owned pretty much all the land. And way down at the bottom, you had, well, almost everybody else. Most people were serfs. Now, they weren't exactly slaves, but they sure weren't free. They were literally tied to the land they worked. And because there were so many people, labor was everywhere, which meant it was dirt cheap. Your life was basically decided the moment you were born.
And then something came from the east, a force that didn't care if you were a lord in a castle or a serf in a field. It was a wave of death that they would come to call the Great Mortality.
So, what was the culprit? A bacterium called Yersinia pestis, and it had the perfect getaway vehicle. It lived on fleas, which lived on rats, which, of course, stowed away on merchant ships. The very trade routes that were bringing wealth and spices from Asia, well, they suddenly became highways for a killer.
And the speed was just terrifying. I mean, look at this. It hits Sicily in 1347. Just 1 year later, it's already tearing through Italy, France, and Spain. By 1349, it's in England and Germany. And by 1351, it had made its way all the way to Russia and Scandinavia. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It was absolutely relentless.
The speed was one thing, but the effect it had on society, that was something else entirely. This wasn't just a disease. It was the complete and total collapse of their entire world.
50%. I mean, just let that number sink in. In less than 5 years, as much as half of the entire population of Europe was just gone. It's a number so huge, it's almost impossible to imagine the sheer scale of human suffering behind it.
And this quote from a writer in Italy at the time, it just brings that giant abstract number crashing down to a devastating reality. This wasn't a statistic. It was the total breakdown of the most basic human bonds. Think about it, a fear so powerful that a father would abandon his own child. That's the world we're talking about.
And of course, the ripple effects were catastrophic. Families were shattered. The authorities, the people in charge, were completely powerless to stop it. The clergy, the priests who were on the front lines trying to comfort the sick, they died in huge numbers. And all of this just shook people's faith in the very institutions, the church, the government, that were supposed to protect them. But, and this is the incredible paradox at the center of this story, out of all that despair, out of all that suffering, the seeds of a massive revolutionary change were planted. It was a completely unintentional and incredibly brutal Great Reset.
Just think about it in the simplest economic terms. Forget all the fancy theories for a second. What happens to the value of something when half of it suddenly vanishes?
What happened was a complete flip. The entire economic world was turned on its head. Before the plague, you had very little land and tons of people, so labor was cheap. Afterwards, suddenly land was everywhere. Entire villages were empty, but the workers who survived were now rare. They were a valuable resource. And this set off a chain reaction. This massive labor shortage, it gave the surviving peasants a power they had never, ever had before. For the first time, they could actually demand higher wages. They could ask for better working conditions. They could even pack up and leave one lord to go work for another who would pay them more. They had leverage, and those rigid chains of feudalism started to crack.
And make no mistake, this wasn't just a temporary change. The shockwaves from this labor revolution would go on to reshape European society for hundreds of years.
The legacy was just profound. The plague didn't cause the end of feudalism, but it sure sped it up. With labor now so expensive, landowners had to find new, more efficient ways to do things, spurring innovation. And as peasants started earning real wages, some of them saved money, leading to the beginnings of a new middle class. The fundamental relationship between the people who ruled and the people who were ruled had changed forever. So we come back to that difficult, central truth of the Black Death. It was an event of almost unbelievable human tragedy. And yet somehow, from those ashes,
a new world began to emerge. A world with more opportunity, more innovation, and more power in the hands of everyday people than anyone could have imagined before.
And that really leaves us with one last big question to think about. When we look at our own world, our economic systems, the value we put on work, the personal freedoms we often take for granted, it forces us to ask how many of these foundations were built not in moments of glory, but on the rubble of one of history's greatest tragedies. It's a powerful thing to remember just how complex and how unbelievably brutal the process of change can be.